Hey everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to be speaking about muscle tissue. And remember, muscle tissue is one of the four main types of tissue in the body. The four types of tissue include epithelial tissues, which, as we've already learned, covers the cavities and lines various parts of the body. Connective tissue, which helps to hold everything together and pack the body together. Muscular tissue, which is important in movement, and nervous tissue, which we haven't gotten to yet, but we will soon, and nervous tissue is important in communication from one part of the body to another. There are three types of muscle tissue. The three types of muscle tissue would be skeletal muscle, and this is what's going to be moving your body around, so your bones. Cardiac muscle, this is what makes up the heart. And smooth muscle, and this is what lines your hollow organs and your vessels and helps move things throughout the body. So the first thing we need to discuss is that a muscle cell is actually called a muscle fiber. So it has its own special name, even though it's a cell like all your other cells, and it has a nucleus and mitochondria and all the normal stuff that a cell would have. But we call it, instead of a muscle cell, we call it a muscle fiber. And this isn't the only thing in a muscle cell that is similar to other cells but has a different name. So for example, the sarcolemma, you can see that right here. The sarcolemma is the plasma membrane around a muscle cell. We also have the sarcoplasm. This is the cytoplasm that's inside a muscle fiber. We also have something called the Sarcoplasmic Reticulum. The Sarcoplasmic Reticulum is a specialized type of endoplasmic reticulum. And remember, in normal cells, the endoplasmic reticulum combined with the ribosomes are where proteins are made. In the muscle fiber, the sarcoplasmic reticulum is a little bit more specialized, and its job is to deal with calcium. I'm going to put that in a red box here. So whenever you hear sarcoplasmic reticulum, think calcium. Its job is to store calcium when the muscle fiber is not contracting. It will release the calcium when you want to contract the muscle fiber, and it will reuptake the calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum for storage when you want to stop contracting the muscle fiber. You can actually see the sarcoplasmic reticulum right here, these sort of purple lines that make kind of a mesh-like network. And you can see that the sarcoplasmic reticulum goes all the way through the muscle fiber. So you notice that each one of these words starts with sarco. Sarco is the prefix for muscle. So anytime you see sarco, you know it has something to do with a muscle fiber. All of these things are very similar to structures that you would find in a normal cell. However, they have slightly different names. There is one structure that is very different in a muscle fiber, and that is this thing that's shown in green here. This is actually called a T-tubule. A T-tubule is an invagination of the sarcolemma, and remember the sarcolemma is just the plasma membrane, into the interior of a muscle fiber. So it's almost as if you can imagine here's a muscle fiber and it's got sort of a plastic bag around it, and you took your finger and you punched a hole, not a hole, but you pushed that plasma membrane deep inside the muscle fiber. The reason we have T-tubules is because the action potential, which is the thing that's going to tell it to contract, is going to run along the outside of the sarcolemma. And when we're ready for this muscle fiber to contract, we need that signal to get down deep into the interior of the muscle fiber, not just cause the fibers on the outside that are right next to the sarcolemma to contract. So the sarcolemma, sarcoplasma, and sarcoplasmic reticulum are all structures that are very similar to things you'd find in other cells. But the T-tubule is actually sort of a hole that goes into the inside of the muscle fiber. So you can see this picture from your textbook. Right here is one muscle fiber. So this is one cell. It's filled with these round objects. You can see one's kind of pulled out. This object that's being pulled out is called a myofibril. And a myofibril is just a cluster of different myofilaments. So you might ask, what's a myofilament? Myofilaments are just tiny strands of proteins. The proteins that we're going to be talking about are actin and myosin, and we're going to come back to that in a few minutes. So you can have these tiny strands of actin and myosin. You bundle them together into a cluster, and that's called a myofibril. And inside of a muscle fiber, you can have hundreds of myofilaments. And in fact, muscle cells do not divide. When your muscle gets bigger, it doesn't get more muscle fibers, it actually creates new myofibrils. So remember we talked about sarco before and how we have all these structures with sarco? Well, you might have noticed that now we're talking about myo. Myo is also a prefix for things having to do with the muscle. So how does this relate to the arm muscle that you might see when you flex your biceps? Well, the muscle fiber, if you take a whole bunch of muscle fibers and put them together, it's called a fascicle. And that would be something like this. And you can see here's a muscle fiber, here's a muscle fiber, here's one. Each one of these circles is a muscle fiber. And when you take that bundle of muscle fibers and you add them together with other bundles of muscle fibers, that finally makes up the entire muscle. That muscle is going to be attached to a bone via a tendon. Let's take a closer look at a myofibril. So remember, a myofibril is a cluster or a collection of myofilaments, tiny little protein strands. When you look at a myofibril, it has very distinct light and dark areas. You can see there's a zigzaggy line here and a zigzaggy line here. And when you look at a radiomicrograph, you can see the zigzaggy line there and the zigzaggy line there. This is actually called the Z line. And from one Z line to another Z line is called a sarcomere. There's that sarco prefix again. A sarcomere is the contractile unit of the muscle fibers. So this is the thing that actually shortens. And you can see we have one sarcomere here, and then another sarcomere is starting there. And then there would be another sarcomere after that. So each of these myofibrils are made up of hundreds or even thousands of sarcomeres that are attached together end to end at the Z line. Right here you can see the middle of the sarcomere, and you can see there's a dark area here and kind of a light area here, a dark area here and a light area there, and then another lightish area there. So you've got a light area in the middle surrounded by two darkish areas, and then on the end right before the Z line you've got two really light areas. And what we're seeing here is we're seeing the myofilaments, those thin proteins, laying next to each other in parallel. So I'm going to draw them out. I'm not a very good artist, but I'm going to try and draw these out for you. Okay, so now what we're looking at is we're going to look at one sarcomere. And remember, a sarcomere is the contractile unit of a muscle fiber. And remember, we talked about actin, and we talked about myosin. Actin is the thin filament, and I always think of actin as being the thin one because it kind of sounds like active, and active people are thinner. Myosin is the thick filament, so it's the other one. And the way this works is you have a thin filament, actin, and then a thicker filament, myosin, and then another thin filament, and then a thick filament of myosin. So you end up with a sarcomere that goes from Z-line to Z-line, and it's a series of overlapping filaments, actin being thin and myosin being thicker. And you can see how we've got a number of different ones. And this gives you that sort of striated look that you see in muscle fibers. But what I didn't tell you is that myosin loves actin. So myosin is going to pull on actin and cause the actin to come together and shorten the sarcomere. That's going to be in the next video though. Stay tuned for the love story between actin and myosin in the next video, Muscle Tissue Physiology. See you in class.